everybody. Welcome back to Chapter 2 of Rebecca McLaughlin's book, Is Christmas Unbelievable? Again, I'm Pastor Joshua Johnson, and I'm here with Tyler Osner.
Hey, everyone.
And so, Chapter 2 is about the Gospels and basically the reliability of the Gospels. So what were some of the first things that caught your attention at the beginning of the chapter?
Obviously, the Harry Potter references. It's always fun to bring in pop culture into something.
Mm-hmm.
And then the telephone game too is kind of the big things that brought back childhood a little bit. And, that's one of the big lessons we learned is going from there. But just really. There's a lot of stuff in here, so I'm kind of ready to get into it.
It's a saturated chapter,
yeah,
for sure. So,
how about you, though? What was some of your favorite things?
I like how she clarifies and addresses some of the probably most common objections that I've seen on social media.
Yeah,
a lot of stuff gets thrown around. Of course, as I mentioned last week, a lot of people claim, "Well, Jesus didn't exist," when there's more than enough information, and even atheist historians were like, "Guys." Jesus existed.
Yes,
we just diverge at the Christmas and Easter part, but we know there was a historical
the
Jesus.
Beginning and the end. So,
so I think that's the part that stood out to me the most because a lot of people can be quick. Atheists, agnostics can be quick to dismiss the Gospels or even the Bible in general. While not actually taking the time to do some research or to come up or to understand how logically consistent the arguments are that John's reliable, Luke's reliable, Matthew, Mark, and even in the letters that they are reliable because they were written down by eyewitnesses, or someone went out like Luke and said, okay, I need to talk to eyewitnesses, and I'm going to compile all of this together.
And I think there's a lot of misconceptions that this was 100, 500 years afterwards that these were put together. They might have been translated then, but these original writings were, within one generation, I would say, of Jesus' walking the earth. So
yes, and I've actually got some thoughts on that when we get to
go
one
further.
of the sections later. Yeah, the lag time section. Well, let's start with the telephone critique by atheists that because there's a lot of oral sharing of Jesus' words, they presume that it was just a big game of telephone, and a lot of stuff got jumbled up and messed up and mixed up.
Yeah, which I always find it. They always use that against the Bible, but they don't use it against other cultures that we've. The Greeks, the Romans, yes, they had a written language, but a lot of it was oral. Only the upper elites could write or read even. So a lot of these stories are based off oral, but we don't get that pass with the Bible a lot of times. So, and that was one thing I've had friends, we've not necessarily argued, but we've talked about, and that was the one thing that's always came up. And I said, well, do you believe the Greeks? Do you believe the Romans? And yeah, they had a written system. I was like, but majority of the stories are coming from not the elites, they're coming from the lower end. So that story's coming maybe even hundreds or 500 years later but we take as history. So that's another thing that kind of shows the biases of what people believe. So
well, and it wouldn't be past any of the disciples to write things down while they were with Jesus.
Yeah.
Just because they existed 2,000 years ago and illiteracy was a challenge for most of the known world doesn't mean that they were all illiterate. I mean, Matthew was a tax collector.
That's what I was about to say.
So he would have had literary abilities, not just to count, but also to write reports. And I mean, who knows, any number of them wrote stuff down what Jesus said while they were traveling.
And I think that's another misconception a lot of people have is they were all fishermen, laborers was what some people have said, and that helps. They came from all different walks of life. Yes, you had your lower, and we had some elites. You have Peter and Mark that were up there, but definitely there's some holes in what's going on.
Well, Peter writes his own letter, so you got First and Second Peter, and so he knew how to read and write.
So
and on top of it too, that she doesn't cover in the book, is that other cultures recognized how well the Jewish people educated their children.
Yeah.
And so if that's the cultural reputation 2,000 years ago, then there's a chance that literacy was better than what we thought it was.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with her. You know, it's not a big game of telephone. She says there on the bottom of page 22 that most scholars think Mark's gospel is written about 35 to 45 years after Jesus' death. I have heard some lectures that there's a growing number of scholars that actually might put that date earlier.
Really?
So, you know, with the date she shared here, what most scholars have been thinking for the last probably 100 years, that puts it, he died in about 33. That puts it in late 60s, early 70s. The last number I saw on the earliness was sometime in the 50s.
Wow.
But again, what we know of the copies we do have, we know they're a copy of a copy of a copy. And so that's where, I think I said last time, we could be one or two archaeological finds away from the first copy, like the second edition.
Yeah, for sure. And that's another thing she kind of gets into here, that a lot of people try to poke holes in, is that, now how could someone remember that far back? Well, I can tell you I'm 28 years old, so I can remember stuff from 20 years ago very vividly. My grandmother just turned 90 a couple weeks ago. She can tell me stuff about when I was a baby, let alone when my mom is and when my grandma is, my great-grandmother, I should say. So it's definitely, when you have large events like this, they're memorable. Like, a person just doesn't forget, and it's not like they would have not had that 2,000 years ago. If anything, they probably have better memories than we do now with all the information thrown at us. You know, there. So, and that's one thing I was thinking about when she was speaking about this, when she was talking about like her mom and her grandma, like, you know, you don't forget large things. So good or bad or whatever, just human psychology you don't just forget, these large things, especially if you'd have someone such as Jesus, the Savior of the world, coming. You wouldn't just forget the things he would have done.
Yes, you pay attention to the Messiah and you remember what he said.
You know, especially curing lepers or curing the blind. You know, that's not something that just you'd forget.
Oh yeah, I mean, and there's been studies where a major event or someone significant in your life, you will recall that. I mean. So, like, a popular question is, you know, where were you on 9/11? Yeah. I can tell you exactly where I was at. I can tell you exactly where I was sitting in the classroom when we first heard the news.
Yeah. So I can as well. Coming home, our school took a position, but not to say anything. But coming home, I always bet my mom home, but she was there. Like, I can tell you the conversation we had the next day about it. You know, sitting, and that's So. That was in, obviously, 2001, 21 years ago now, I guess. So I had to think about that for a second. So I don't believe that's really holes in the bucket. And I think that's a term I'm going to be using throughout all of this.
And one thing, too, as I was thinking about it, is that we talk about memorization skills. A lot of times in the ancient world, and you see this actually quite a little bit in the Old Testament, is that when someone is sent with a report, they repeat it verbatim or really, really close to verbatim. And that was something that was expected. If you were told something, you were to share it exactly like your boss or your master or whatever wanted to share it with you. The instance I'm thinking right now is when Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. And he espouses the exact same message to, my goodness, I'm blanking on the name now, but Rebecca's father as the way Abraham said it to the servant. And so the memorization bills, because you couldn't, there was not a lot of pen and paper. So you had to make sure you're paying attention and remember what was said to you.
We mentioned that last week. You know, it's not just, you know, going to buy your 10-cent notebook, and you know, it was a process to get paper at that time. And even
It was expensive.
It was expensive, but it was also even to get the utensils to write. So, it was definitely, so sometimes it's easier just to make sure you say it 3 or 4 times and get them going. So,
for sure. So that kind of gets us into the next section about the lag time.
Yeah.
And I mean, as we talked about before, they could have written stuff down, and there's a growing number argument of earlier dates, and not just for Mark, but also for Matthew, Luke, and John. That the argument's bringing them closer to the time of Jesus in about a decade or 2.
Yeah.
And so, again, who knows what
sure.
might be found still in Israel.
Yeah.
So I'm going to think of anything I want to highlight here, because we kind of covered the gambit of the lag time. And here's another thing, too. I think we talked about last time as well, is that the amount of early copies we have of the Gospels in particular, and we've got even earlier copies, I think, of Paul's letters, if I'm remembering correctly, is that these are more reliable timeline-wise, as close to the event as compared to other writings. I think I mentioned Tacitus in the history of Rome last time. And I think that's just an important point to remember, is that a lot of stuff that's taught in schools, and again, I'm kind of repeating myself, we have centuries, and in some cases, 1,000 years between the earliest copy we have and the when the document was supposedly written. Yeah. And for the Gospels, I mean, we're within a decade or 2 or 3.
For sure, a generation. And that's usually in your game of telephone, when it comes down the line from stories, you're not going to get too far off.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
For sure.
The stories my dad tells me are firsthand. I'm getting the actual stories. What I'm telling, hopefully I tell my kids about my dad is firsthand or secondhand, but I'm going to be remembering the way he told me. So that's a lot different than 1,000 years. How many generations are in 1,000 years?
oh my goodness gracious! I mean, we think about 1,000 years. I mean, so it's 2022. That's 1,022. Yeah. I mean, that's the medieval period.
Yeah. So because I take a generation as 25 years is what I was kind of always. So it's kind of. Yeah, but I also think there's a lot of, like we said just a little bit ago, a lot of misconceptions on when these were actually recorded, and I think that's what she does a really good job of pushing the correct facts for people to understand what we're talking about.
Yes, for sure. And then she poses the question, how do we know they weren't exaggerating? And of course she references back to Harry Potter when I guess Ron was exaggerating one of their adventures.
Yes.
And of course she points to, you don't, with things that are in the Gospels, there's things you don't really go out of your way to exaggerate, or there's things you wouldn't want to exaggerate.
I think she gets into that a lot with Peter, and that's in the next section. But yeah, it's a lot of this. There would be no reason to exaggerate, in my opinion. It's why would you? Yeah. There's nothing to gain. Usually, when you exaggerate something, it's something for you to gain or to look better. Like when she was talking about Ron, making it seem like he was a lot better. The situation was a lot worse, and that he did a lot better than what he did. But this would give, the ability to, if you're going to exaggerate, kind of like what we talked about last one, that if you're going to make something up, you wouldn't make up a census that is recorded. You would make something up along, like Rebecca mentioned, going to a family function or whatever. Like, if you're going to exaggerate, usually you take it just a little bit too far outside than what this would be. Like, this is believable. Like, this could happen. Well, or did happen, I should say.
And if people were to exaggerate, I mean, there were so many eyewitnesses that could call them out on the exaggeration. Like, no, that didn't really happen. Because, as she points out, why would you make up a virgin birth? Why would you make up the miracles? Why would you make up the resurrection? And she goes to point out that one of the reasons why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John put names in there is like, if they were still alive, you could go ask them.
Yeah.
And in fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 he says up to 500 people, and of course he gives a short list of names. He's like, yep. Go ask them, just
sure.
go down the road or the highway and you can
Yeah.
go ask them yourselves that they experienced the risen Christ.
Yeah. These aren't made up people. These are real. Go find them, ask the question, and make your decision from there. So
yeah, you don't provide people a way to prove you wrong.
Yeah.
You provide ways for people to verify what you said.
Yeah.
And that's where too, like at the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, is that from my understanding, the genealogies were kept in the temple.
Yeah.
And so for them to put the genealogies in the gospel, someone could have taken that, because the temple wasn't destroyed till 70 AD. So there was 40 years, just under 40 years, where people could have taken, let's say written. So maybe they had 20 years, but still they could go to the temple
still
and
almost
look
like
at genealogies.
That's a generation if you think of it. So like there's
the
still
elders had to be consecrated at the temple.
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah, you have a choice.
Just, the Wild West of people having kids and no records. There was lineage was very important.
Yeah, and that's one thing that in our small group we've talked about several times. We started in Matthew actually, but one thing that always came up was the Jewish people were very particular on how their history was written, and like you said, we're talking about with the genealogy, it made it very hard to make something up. Like there wasn't someone, they may have 12 kids, it may have been 4, but this was all right, they had 6 kids, this is their names, this is who they married, and goes on from there. And this is, if
you have questions on how precise they wanted to be about their the keeping track of the genealogy, check out Chronicles, because quite a bit of even First Chronicles is just this person had this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid.
For sure. When we did that in small group, it was a full almost page, I felt like, of just names and who they were married to and the descendants of David, or even his descendants, I guess. I'm trying to think people before David.
To, Abraham and Noah and even Adam.
Yeah. So I was trying to think of the term before, the opposite of descendants. So,
and one thing when she talked about the resurrection, you don't make that up. Is one thing I want to make sure I wanted to share with you and everyone else who's watching, is that there's this thing called the embarrassment principle, to where get more into the next section. No, I'm sorry, I'm totally mixing up my thoughts. So the one thing I want to share about the resurrection is that people don't die for what they know is a lie. That's the kind of thing I've attributed. People don't die for what they know is a lie.
That's very true.
And so if it meant death, to talk about Jesus being crucified and rising from the dead, if you know it's a lie, you keep your mouth shut, because there's nothing to gain on perpetuating the lie. But these guys were willing to die.
And several, not just Jesus, you have several others that were as well, of his disciples, and even his brother. His brother, who was not a believer when he was alive. And so the disciples, the ladies, and like Paul says, up to 500 folks. Go ask them. And so the embarrassment principle, that's the next section here on 28. And so the embarrassment principle means, if someone, especially in the ancient world, wrote something that was embarrassing, especially about themselves, it tends to argue that they're not making it up. Because if you're writing a fiction, and especially when you want to promote something, you want to make yourself look good. You don't make yourself look like an idiot, like Peter, who Mark, who's attributed to being the eyewitness for Mark's gospel. And of course, Peter's very honest, about his messing up over and over and over and over. And so that's where I want to make sure I shared that, was the embarrassment principle, because if you want to promote something, you don't put in embarrassing stories. No. Or you make it about someone else. But you definitely don't put yourself in a bad position if you're making it up.
Oh yeah. You definitely want make yourself and your cause look good. because
Yeah, 'cause
Jesus gives it to the disciples, and the disciples, they all messed up, but yet they're willing to be honest in that. This was this is what happened, and Jesus came and showed up and
forgave them for their sins
and unleashed them anyways into the world.
Yeah, it's amazing when you really start thinking of what Jesus did when he was alive, let alone afterwards. It's
the patience. I think someone said that Peter must have worn peppermint socks because he had his foot in his mouth so much.
Yep. I've never heard that, but that is very true.
She also mentions there in that section that the ladies were the first eyewitnesses and proclaimers of Jesus being risen from the dead. And that's a big deal. And that goes against to the embarrassment principle because women's testimony wasn't considered valid, really, back then. And if you wanted to have credibility to your cause, it should have been Peter or John.
Yeah, that would have made that.
But again, honesty in how and what actually happened that first Easter.
For sure. Okay. Yeah, and moving on to the next section, because I think we've kind of hit all of that.
Oh, yeah.
Is the differences between the Gospels. And this was one that I kind of connected for me, and we were talking about before this, how we mentioned that Luke was chronological order. This is from day one to the day I stopped writing. Where Rebecca kind of makes the comment that this is going towards movies. So the movie setup, going back in foreshadowing, and you have the flashbacks to show, to connect events together, and I think for a lot of people that's a lot easier way of writing.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned last time too is that when we in ancient biographies, sometimes they were written in a particular order, not chronological, to prove a point. So kind of like a build-up. So like if I were to tell you some crazy stories about high school, I would start with the least crazy and build up to the most crazy.
Yeah.
If someone were to say stories about someone's journey to be a great athlete, it may start. Most of it might be chronological, but there might be instances where it's like, I took a leap forward here, or I took a step back here, or like a documentary where they they start at the end, and then they go back to the beginning. So
then come back to the end, and it's, or even start in the middle. Some of them do that, and you come back. So sometimes you got to keep the reader in check too. And I think some of that is they wanted to. I don't want to say entertainment factor, but almost to that point, you have to pull people in.
Yep.
And once you pull them in, you give them the information and let them make that decision. So no one's forcing us to be Christians. We choose to be Christians.
Yes.
And I think you got to, just like anything, you got to bring them in to show them what it is. So.
Yep. Another she points about difference of the Gospels that there were, different contexts, because there was times Jesus was talking to the Jewish people. There's times he encountered Gentiles, and so I think one thing we forget that with the differences, maybe with some of the stories like the parables and whatnot, is that Jesus did share the same point message over and over and over and over, which would help with the memorization part. Because when you hear something over and over and over and over, it's easier to recall. But sometimes you tweak a little bit depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
Like, just for example, for me as a pastor, where I preach has an influence on the type of illustrations I use.
Yeah.
If I'm, in a rural context, I'll use more farming illustrations. If I'm, of course, sometimes I still use the Avengers and Jones anyways. But
it makes it fun.
If I were in an urban context, they would have no understanding if I used a farming illustration.
Yeah.
Likewise, if I used an inner city illustration in a rural context, a lot of people had trouble connecting with that.
Yeah, and it's also, people have to be able to read the crowd too. Like you have to connect with them at a different level than it would be connecting with this group of people or going on from there. So, and one of the things she talked about that also people try to poke holes in is that there's the same stories throughout the gospel, but they just have just a little bit different.
Yeah.
So what I kept thinking as I was kind of getting ready for this was my siblings and I, we talk about, a family vacation or anything like that. Well, my perception of it is different than my younger brother Logan's, who's 16, or he's not 16, he's 14. Around 15 something around there. We'll figure. I'm sure he'll say something about that now. But
comment below.
Yeah, Logan. We'll see how that goes. But a quick example, my senior year, we went to Alaska on a cruise, and once I graduated, but my younger brother Logan wasn't even in kindergarten at the time. I think he was probably 3 going on 4. The things we've seen, we were sitting right next to each other, if not on my lap doing this. He pays attention to certain details, and I would pay attention to another detail. So we know it might be, and our stories may be the exact same, but what we're speaking about is different. And so that's what I feel like when people talk about that. I said, like we would sit in here today, and I would go talk to my wife about this later, and what you talk to Allison about this later, we'd probably same story, but different things we talk about.
Different angles.
Yeah. So, and that's the whole time she's speaking about that. That's in my mind exactly what I was thinking about. So,
well, and that's where again that with the different contexts, just it depends on the perspective of who's writing it down, and which version of the story that they're recalling when Jesus shared it. Because again, he shared it over and over and over and over and over. Because it says he traveled and preached, and if he's got a main goal in the message, you tend to not say well, what am I going to preach on this year to cover a full gamut of stuff?
Everyone,
I'm focusing on this, and I'm going to have everything pointing in that direction.
Yeah.
And if there's no Facebook Live, there's no YouTube, and so you repeat over and over and over and over again. This a lot of speakers when they travel the country, or comedians.
Yeah. Motivational.
You go and you do the same thing across 50 different states, and you're doing the same show.
Yeah.
But of course, some jokes may tweak because of a particular style of joke or particular content, but it's almost an exact cookie cutter across the
I always think if you go to a concert and they almost all the concerts I've been to have been in Kansas, so they'll say something about how are we doing tonight, Kansas, or whatever, the exact same thing. You just change that one word, or they'll change the words in their songs. This mentioned Kansas versus Georgia or whatever they were talking about. So that's another thing. I was thinking of motivational speakers. They have the same basics of the story they're wanting to get out, but from there they change it just enough to be relevant to the group of the people they're doing. So, and that's also what I was thinking about when she was talking about this. So, that was, pretty much my whole thought process when I was reading that. So,
and that's just what we said at the beginning. There's when it comes to the memorization. I mean, and him saying things over and over and over again, and the fact that the impact he had. I mean, if you're witnessing miracles. And the fact that for him to invite these guys and a few of these girls to travel around with him, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that not many people get to do. You soak in everything that you can. Yeah. And again, if they had a chance to write stuff down, I mean, I bet they wrote it down.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
and one of the funny things, I'm a banker by trade, so we get training on robbery, and one of the things first thing they tell you to do, obviously lock the door, don't let them back in, but is everyone in there needs to spread out, do not talk, because you start to get everything in. Everyone's thoughts will be the same. So if I say I thought he had blue eyes and blonde hair, and I tell that to you, and you're like, well, did he? So, and that's one thing also in here she was talking about is like when they were writing these, they were kind of on their own. They probably weren't picking each other's brains, trying to figure out how to put the best story together. And that's why you have those different details. So we may have if we're sitting in that situation, 95% of our details might be the same, but you might put on that he had a gold wedding ring on, and I say that he has a Rolex watch on. Those two separate things may be the difference of catching them or not. Yeah. So that's one thing that one of the few things I took in some of those trainings. Carrie, don't worry about that. I'll take care of it when it happens. But yeah, I just really, those details when you're not just, they're not the same people. They're not going to see the same things. Yeah. So that's one thing I was thinking about in here too, is when we were reading all this.
I had a quick thought, but I lost it.
Sorry.
No, I don't. I think I was holding on to it because I want to make sure I wasn't going to step on the toes of any of the other chapters.
Yeah.
But I got notes, folks, so I'm going to double check to make sure. Because I want to make sure I give you everything that I've got, because there's just so much in her book, and there's also so much that's out there.
Yeah. And I was about to say, while he's looking at that, we have this on the Facebook page. We have it on the podcast itself. If you guys have questions you want us to talk about, feel free to comment, all that fun stuff, and maybe we can have a little quick discussion about that.
Oh, absolutely. So, yes, please. Yeah, if you've got questions, put those in the comment section below in the box, and feel free to hit the like button and share if you enjoyed this as well.
For sure.
One more fun factoid. Well, I don't know if it's a fact, but it's a theory from a scholar I heard. Is that the theory is that Mark, the way the gospel's written, the theory is that it was designed to be preached from.
Really?
I'm not sure how many scholars support it, but the guy I heard it from,
it would make sense.
I agree with him quite a bit on a lot of things, and I find him very credible. And so it's very interesting to think about how Mark is written, that it could be written in a way to be preached from.
Yeah. So you almost think if he wrote it from what he was preaching, if he was taking, what he was saying, writing that down almost. So,
because if it's, Peter's perspective, and if it was, kind of still early on in his ministry, and Mark or whoever is just saying, what are you talking about then? What are you talking about next? And he goes, well, I'm preaching on this, and I'm preaching on that, and this is the story I'm going to tell. And so Mark's just, I imagine, just writing as Peter's talking, and so, and of course, if you're following these guys while they're preaching, and he says, well, I'm going to go over the whole life of Jesus, and then preach on it. I mean, write down the story, and boom, you can put together an order of Jesus' life. Whether it's in the style of ancient biography or history.
Yes. So, but I think unless you have anything else to add,
I can't think of anything else. That other thought didn't come back to me, so it must have not been that cool.
We'll hit it next week, right? But no, I think I got all my thoughts out as well. So
sounds good.
If you guys have any thoughts as well, again, comment, like, all that fun stuff. So.
Absolutely. And we did not plan red. So this is,
I would say this is orange.
Orange?
So
Okay.
I guess. I don't know. My wife tells me it's orange. So.
Red orange or blood orange?
I don't know. It's comfy. That's all that matters to me.
Close. It's the red family.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, guys, thank you for watching. Again, comment below, hit that like button, hit that share button. Hopefully, we'll see you again in chapter 3. Take care, and God bless.
Bye, guys.